Good morning, Max, and thank you very much for giving some time to the Mint to talk about your work.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
So I was wondering if I could start with sort of going back and hearing how did you initially get involved in working on the issue of inequality?
It was kind of if I'm honest, you want the honest truth, it was basically a bit of an accident. I mean, I had a boss at Oxfam at that time, lovely woman, Barbara Stocking, and she used to go to Davos every year. And Davos was, really a kind of hobnobbing thing. And we used to dread it because she'd come back from Davos with all these business cards of these corporate execs and so we had to build some kind of positive relationship with all these evil corporates. And I managed to persuade her. I mean, it was partly the time because it was 2013, and if you imagine the world out there, her son at that time, I think he was in his early 20s, he was really into Occupy, and you had that atmosphere out there in the world of inequality was back, and you just had Piketty's book, and so it was pushing at a reasonably open door. And we thought, okay, why don't, because we never used to do media work around Davos, we'd just send Barbara there, So we thought, let's put out a press release with, a fact or two and just see how it does, because we'd never really done that before. I remember talking to the head of media about it and saying, let's just give it a go. And I think to this day, still, it was the biggest media moment. I think we had one that was slightly bigger about 3 or 4 years later. And I'm talking biggest media moment in our history. It was kind of,
Wow.
we came up with this killer fact, which was that 85 men owned the same as half the world. And I remember looking at my Twitter feed, and it was up. I just typed in 85 men, and it was updating so fast that it was just a blur. This is what it must be like to be a celebrity or something and have millions of followers. It's like you got an insight into what their life is like, and it was just incredible. And I had loads of anecdotes, but my favourite is our head of campaigns. He lives in Hanoi. He's lived there for 20 years. He's married to a Vietnamese woman, and he was stood at the bus stop in Hanoi, and this grizzled old Vietnamese man came up to him and started immediately saying, "Have you heard this shocking fact? I'm absolutely appalled. 85 men own the same as half the world." And of course, no idea that it came from Oxfam. No attribution. It just became a massively I think it was quoted by Obama. It was, low. It just it hit the moment, and that was how we ended up campaigning on inequality. It was a complete accident, and we suddenly realised that as an organisation, it was a really, and I think for all NGOs, it's a really important way to shift your perspective and put on a different pair of glasses, if you like, because up until that point, I'd been very much a part of Make Poverty History and the kind of anti-poverty movement and amazing things achieved. But it was a campaign with no baddies, really. It was all about ending poverty. But the great thing about an inequality focus is it asks you about who's winning, not just who's losing. It makes you look to where the power is on every issue. And I think that was really profoundly important. And I think and that's why it's lasted for us as a kind of overarching frame and has spread into much of our other work like climate change. And then the other thing I would say is that, I still think this is really important, and it's always a balancing act, is it at that time, it was just after the financial crisis, you had austerity in Europe and brutal austerity here in the UK. It was a recognition also that inequality gives you an ability to talk about poor people in rich countries and what they're going through, and rich people in poor countries and how corrupt they often are and how crooked they are. And so it enables you to shift away from a frame that can be somewhat simplistic sometimes, and it's still important one. I mean, but the idea that everyone in the rich world is fine and everyone in the poor world is suffering is also something that inequality forces you to challenge. So I think just for lots of reasons, it ticked lots of boxes, so we've kept going ever since, and this is our 10th. January this year will be our 10th Davos report, and I joke about the fact that as head of inequality policy now is what I'm at Oxford. I wasn't then. I was head of campaigns at OGB. We didn't have this job then, but it's a wonderful job. I love it, but I'm glad it's not performance related pay, because in the 10 years we've been working on inequality, the number of billionaires has doubled. Their wealth has doubled. Yeah. Particularly since COVID-19, you've had this absolutely insane increase in wealth at the top. So it's been a great campaign. We've got to keep fighting. But to be honest, we're running to stand still if that, on inequality at the moment. Yeah.
But it's interesting. I wonder, have you thought, why had no one before 2030 talked about inequality? Because I mean, it's not a new thing, is it? I mean, how had it disappeared off the agenda, or was anyone else campaigning on inequality prior to that?
Not really. I mean, I honestly think that it was the financial crisis that changed everyone's view of life. Up until that point, even those on the left, including me, were thinking like, okay, the world is a terrible place, but things are broadly getting better in one way or another, and and then after 2008, it just didn't, and ever since then, it hasn't felt that way, has it? And I think for those working on climate change, that wasn't the case. Obviously, people campaigning on climate change were perhaps not as Pollyanna as those working on aid or ending poverty. There was a big shift at that time, if you remember, to tax as well, and tax fits very well with the inequality frame.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just think just generally there was a coalition of things that made the world think about it. But I think to the extent that the global narrative is driven by a kind of powerful elites, which it is, I think, so just saying that the IMF, just at their big meetings just in October this year, the head of the IMF, we've got used to the fact that, in every one of her kind of opening speeches, she'll link to inequality, her concerns about inequality. And this year she didn't mention it, and yeah, inequality is worse now, worse now globally, worse now in the developing world than it's been in a very long time. So I think in a sense, it doesn't really suit their narrative at the moment. Their narrative is about the war, the energy crisis, inflation, and they've kind of moved on. So yes, I think in some ways we're struggling more to put inequality on the map at the kind of official level than we were even 5-6 years ago, which is quite revealing in a sense. You think that once something's on the agenda, it stays on the agenda, but we live in a fickle world, so yeah, let's see.
And I suppose they can turn that neatly to say, well, inflation is making people poorer, and then they try and forget who's actually gaining from inflation or who's getting increases above inflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's they could be doing some. It does. The staff have also, if we talk about the IMF in particular, they had an amazing head of research, and they put out a series of amazing papers in 2013, 14, 15 that were just could have been written by Oxfam, except they were cleverer. I mean, the inequality harms growth. They even put out a paper saying that neoliberalism was a mistake.
Yes, I remember.
So it was an amazing moment of shifting.
But that was just
and
their
a lot of
research
those,
group, wasn't it?
It was just their research group. So there was a lot of, I mean, there was one or two odd progressive mission chiefs as well. It's and one or two things done at country level, but really it was their research team. But I remember hearing from a friend about they put out their paper on neoliberalism, and there was a absolutely excoriating editorial in the Financial Times aimed at the IMF. And this guy who was the head of research, he said to me that it almost got him fired because it accused the IMF of wearing a baseball cap on its head backwards and pretending to be an NGO or something. It was kind of, and you could tell they really rattled the kind of neoliberal consensus.
Yeah.
And it was a glorious moment. But I do think, yeah, there's absolutely no factual reason to move away from inequality now. If anything, there's a lot more of a reason. So two things I would say. The first one is one thing that we didn't really dwell on enough, I think, in 2013-14. We just looked at the scale of inequality. We didn't really look at the causes. Is the incredible impact of quantitative easing on driving up asset prices and the wealth of those at the very top. So when you saw that second enormous injection of money into the world during COVID-19, which of course was necessary and protected so many jobs, and not for a second would I say I was against it, but it does all, instead of trickling down, it all floods upwards, and as a result, that's driven the first explosion in wealth. And now the second one, as you rightly point out, is there are very big winners from inflation. We've got new numbers coming out for our Davos report next year, looking at the There are solid studies from the ECB in the US that 50% of the increase in prices is because of corporate profiteering. This is more of a cost of profit crisis than a cost of living crisis. So there are big winners. There's always big winners, Henry. There's always people making out, and it seems to me like no matter what happens, the richest people seem to get richer. So I think that's what we're trying to draw attention to in our next report, and really make the point that this crisis has got some really significant winners.
It was noticeable actually that Liz Truss, in her brief period in the headlines, talked about the fact that people had been talking about inequality too much and they had to talk about growth now. And I wonder in some funny way that she actually caught that she was representing a sort of mood on the right to try and close off the discussion of inequality.
What if she was? I mean, the fact that she failed so badly
might be a good sign.
Was probably a good sign. And I do think I think out there in the world, it's really, I mean, we've just got this cast of insane characters of billionaires that are just a gift for campaigners, So I think in the popular imagination, at least, the idea there are these like super rich people at the top that are a little bit mad. But, I think Elon Musk has probably got as many fans as he's got detractors, and there's a lot of people that, particularly in the developing world, we hear this a lot, that, people are, in polling terms, they call it, I think they call it polyphasic. So you can have two thoughts at the same time. So yes. People think that all these billionaires got there through corruption and crookedness, but at the same time, they're quite proud of them. And my friend Anna Arundel, she was in Mexico, living in Mexico, working for Oxfam, when one of, I think, our second report came out. And it was during that time that for a brief period, Carlos Slim was the richest man in the world. And she remembered being in a public minibus when it came on the radio and everyone cheered. These are poor people in Mexico cheering because their guy is the richest man on earth. So but yet polling in all of these countries will show you that the massive population, they really support higher taxes on the rich. They absolutely think rich people should pay more, and they think they're all got there because they're crooks. So it's kind of, we live in a messed up world in terms of people's imaginations. But I do think it's very hard for inequality to completely disappear, no matter how much elites might want that to happen. And hopefully the Liz Truss moment showed that really clearly here in the UK.
And so the trend in terms of the popular imagination, has the trend in terms of caring about inequality been going up over the last 10 years? Is it now dipping as well?
No, I think I tell you, it depends which audience you're talking about. But I think where the really exciting energy is and where the coalition of interests is coming is between the kind of, the anti-inequality movement and I'd say two things. I'd say, firstly, I think economic inequality, I think for the last 2-3 years has taken a backseat to kind of, and when I say economic inequality, I mean like at a national level, so between rich people in Britain and poor people in Britain, or rich people in Kenya and poor people in Kenya. I think it's taken a backseat to kind of the return of a really robust and important discussion about colonialism and kind of, the extraction of wealth from the global north to global south, which I think is really important and timely, and that was really wonderful to see. But it's about keeping that balance between those two things. And then the other thing that's really exciting, and so it's almost like another kind of inequality is taken centre stage. And then I would add that I think the thing we were doing recently, we just put out a paper just ahead of the COP looking at the of billionaires, and we've been doing more and more work on climate and inequality. And we interviewed a guy for our podcast, actually. He's an Extinction Rebellion protester in the Netherlands, young guy's 19, history student, and he'd been part of that amazing group of people that occupied Schiphol Airport, and they broke in through the fence, and they didn't just block the airport, which would be making a statement about climate change. They actually blocked the private jets. And I think that was really symbolic, the fact that for them, it was a natural kind of illusion, if you like, between the super rich, their appalling consumption, their pouring disregard for the future of the planet, and the kind of inequality in climate just came together very, very clearly for them. And I think that really excites me, because I think that's where the passion and the energy is with young people. I think that's where the global movement is. So if we could see a kind of more and more the coming together of a kind of, if you like, an economic inequality based analysis and the fight against climate breakdown, and one that really looks at the rich and powerful people that are driving our fossil fuel future, as well as the kind of important but dominant narrative about the rich world being the bad guy and the poor world being the good guy. I think that will only help, because I think it. Well, of course, I would think that. I'm just a sad old Marxist. But I do think that we need to look at the power and influence of the ruling class in every issue, because they're the ones who control everything. And also from a more practical point of view, if you just want to do good climate policy, it's a mistake to have kind of policies that are blind to income differentials. To have a flat tax on carbon, or that. In any form of policy making, ignoring the distribution is crazy, and that's what the French saw with the Yellow Vest movement. And if we end up in a world where, doing the right things for climate change are associated by the mass of the population with the ruling class being additionally unfair on them, then that would be a terrible state of affairs, wouldn't it? Because then the right wing would seize on that, and then doing anything green is seen as kind of elitist. And so I think it's profoundly important that we force governments to make climate policy in a way that quite obviously makes rich people pay a much higher price. And if we do that, then I think society will be more bought into the kind of big transition that we need.
I think it's very interesting, this interaction between the environmental and social inequality sort of agenda, isn't it? Because I find that, some people, environmentalists, are quite uncomfortable about that, that they, of course, they care about the environment and they do recycling, etc. And then when you start pointing out the sort of differentials and inequality and racism, even in climate change and so on, I found a real sort of discomfort with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's as old as the left, if you like, the struggle between red and green, isn't it? And I think on both sides, and I think the people like Jason Hickel have been amazing at kind of bringing those two agendas together, really challenging both sides of the equation. I think others have been less good at it, to be honest, and we have those debates inside Oxfam, and I think Oxfam in particular has a role to play, bringing the perspective of the poorest people to the table. We're ultimately a development organisation, not a historically green organisation, and I think that has some profound and important, implications. And we're having a big debate internally, for instance, about what do we think about African countries exploiting gas reserves, for instance. Because half of Oxfam, and I'll be honest, the Northern European bit of Oxfam wants to join with everyone else and demand that Africa leaves all that gas in the ground in the interest of the planet. But many of our African colleagues are saying, well, that's incredibly unfair. You're busy investing hugely, particularly since the war. Europe's pouring money into gas facilities and, and whatever. I mean, I think this is official because the IEA have said it. I mean, it's not, I think it's pretty much agreed on both sides of this debate that whatever Africa does is fairly inconsequential to 1.5 degrees. It's not going to make or break the future of the planet. It's what the rest of the world is doing that is going to make a difference. So that's a really live debate, and that is a classic example of that balancing act between people and planet. But I think then again, inequality is really important because there's some amazing work that's been done looking at what would be needed for everyone on Earth, and I mean that's 8 billion people, to live a reasonably decent standard of living. Have universal health care, see their kids educated, have a roof over their heads, electricity, and maybe a laptop. There's some great work done in Nature looking at this and looking at the energy required and what that would mean. And it's quite heartening in a way. It's actually really possible for us to do it. But the only way to do it is to massively tackle inequality, because we have and invest in the kinds of policies that can do it at a very low carbon footprint. So it gives you another whole set of arguments for public services instead of private services, for instance, because you can deliver a much greater quality of life for a much lower per capita GDP. If you think, in Costa Rica or indeed Cuba, you could get universal health coverage, and You know, I remember going to Cuba years ago, just seeing all the old people doddering around because their healthcare, you didn't need to see a Potemkin health center or be convinced, because it just looked completely different to any developing country I'd ever been to, because there were just old people everywhere, you know, and they were really healthy and chatty. So you can do that for very low per capita GDP, but you can only do it if you invest in universal public services. You can't do it through the private sector. You can't do it through privatizing. And so it's just another whole reason for if you've only got a certain amount of carbon to burn and a certain amount of GDP growth that's possible, if we're going to stay within planetary boundaries, then you need to make sure that is as fairly allocated as we possibly can, to make sure that we're not living in a world that beats climate change, but only at the cost of insisting that, you know, 60% of the population are literally on the edge of starvation. I mean, that can't be right, can it? So I think, again, it's another good reason to bring the inequality and the climate frame together and fight for a fairer world and our planetary future at the same time.
But I suppose when people get nervous about the future and what they're facing, there can be a sort of instinctive feel to look after their own to the exclusion of others. That, you know, maybe we've seen that in Trump and so forth, where people begin to group more and start othering others, knowing that there's a sort of resource crunch and that they face loss if they're going to share this stuff with people who they don't feel to be part of their tribe.
Maybe, but I think I don't know why, but I was just born with an immense faith in the rationality of ordinary people and the fact that it is manipulated consistently, you know. And I think what's more the case is that the left has failed to capture the imagination of ordinary people around the world. That's true, and so the right has capitalised on their fears. So I think that is true too. But I think it's also a deliberate policy of consistent distraction, as we know. We see all the time in Britain, don't we? You know, like it's kind of, you know, whatever you do, don't look at those rich people. Look, it's immigrants, it's this, it's that. You know, it's anything but the thing people should be focused on, and that's incredibly powerful, particularly when you look at the direct relationship between, you know, the ownership of the media in country after country and very powerful people. So it's I don't think you need to be a conspiracy theorist to know that, you know, people are being consistently and systematically misled in country after country. And I suppose deep down, I believe that if people weren't misled, that generally people are really nice. But maybe I'm just too positive, you know. And I think, you know, given a chance, that, you know, people like each other, you know, and they want the best. I mean, I love my favourite Oxfam story is it was the second campaign that Oxfam ever worked on, and it was in 1948. And it was together with lots of others, but the publicist Victor Gollancz, who wrote for The Observer, he did a photo diary from the ruins of Germany, and he was Jewish, and this was literally 1948. So imagine, you know, the war's just over, and Germans were starving. They were literally starving in their tens of thousands. They were on like 700 calories a day, and there was this huge flood of sympathy from across Britain, and people wanted to send food parcels to Germans. So they didn't want the government to do it. They wanted to take their own already meager rations and send some of that food to starving Germans. And our campaign, along with others, was to force the Labour government to allow that to happen. And we won. And, you know, loads and loads of food parcels were sent from ordinary people in Britain to Germany. And to think of the sympathy and what does that say about the British public? And then you look at the response when we had the Syrian refugees and when we had the Ukrainians, you know, okay, then the media tells us all the negative things, but the huge upwelling of support and people accommodating refugees. And I think I choose to think that people are basically nice. Yeah.
I'm with you on that. So just a last, I mean, what do you think, you know, since you talked about your most successful campaigning moment back when you published that 85 men had all the wealth of 50% of the world. What, looking forward, how are you going to get attention? What do you think? Do you have, in terms of your campaigning strategies and images and so forth, how are you going to keep this up there as an issue?
Such a great question and really timely. I mean, Davos is still delivering for us. So, you know, it's still our biggest moment of the year. And we've had a very strange couple of years because Davos was online for a couple of years. And then the physical meeting happened in May instead of January. I mean, it is the perfect moment of the year as well, because nothing else is going on.
Right.
So let's see how we do this January, because it has been, we've still done okay. I mean, we did a couple of great reports on the inequality virus, the impact of COVID on inequality and feeding off inequalities. So that's still going to be a big moment for us. But I think the thing that really interests me is trying to build up. I'm learning from previous movements, whether it's tax justice or debt or trade, kind of group of progressive governments that are willing to speak out on the issue and challenge other countries. I think we were getting somewhere on that before COVID hit, and now we want to kind of revive that. And obviously the big ray of hope is in Latin America, but they tend to be very insular. So get working with them to, with the exception of Lula. Actually, Lula was the reason we have an SDG on inequality is almost entirely because of Brazil. So they're a lot more outward looking. But I think if you ask me one thing I'd like to achieve on inequality in the next couple of years is that people are hearing from Oxfam less and more from a group of, inspiring leaders from North and South who are saying that unless we tackle inequality, we can't fix the problems of the planet, we can't reach social justice, and these they have to be done together, and that they start to also implement policies. And because I think we've shifted the dial on lots of policies. I think there is a sense in which, for instance, talking about greater taxation of the rich is now pretty well accepted across the political spectrum. And of course the backlash to Liz Truss in a sense shows that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, and I think that's true in lots of countries. So I think doubling down on that and getting some countries to, we worked out, I shouldn't really say this because it's a fact under embargo, but I think half of the world's billionaires live in a country that doesn't even have an inheritance tax. There are many countries worldwide that don't have inheritance taxes, that don't have property taxes, that tax capital gains at a fraction of the amount they tax income. So there's some really low-hanging fruit as well for lots and lots of countries, in the sense that it wouldn't take much for every country on earth to have a decent property tax, and property taxes are very progressive and very often paid significantly more by rich people. Every country to have an inheritance tax to stop the emergence of a new aristocracy. So the campaigner in me thinks that the future is with government speaking out and then successes at national level that become a sense of kind of momentum, if you like. And I think, I think that could be really positive. I feel really positive about those kinds of things happening, because I think there is a real desire, and people can see, perhaps it took two crises on the trot, because in COVID, we saw loads and loads of money poured into the economy, but we didn't see an increase in taxation on rich people. Like 95% of countries, we do a survey, it's called the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, and we looked at 164 countries, and we found like 9 that increased taxes on the rich during the crisis, which, students of inequality will all tell you that the key moment to jack up taxes on the rich is at the time of war or crisis, because they're on the back foot and it's a feeling of solidarity. And so the government's massively missed an opportunity there. But in a sense, the fact that we've rolled straight into another crisis means that I think we're more likely to get, and we've already seen significant windfall taxation on energy companies in Europe, that we've got lots of proposals from various different governments on increases in taxes on corporates. And I think we will continue to see pushes to increase tax on rich people. So I think that's good. And I really hope we get there.
Brilliant. Well, that's a great note to end on, and I look forward to seeing how Davos goes for you in January. And thank you very much for talking to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I love talking about inequality.
Brilliant.